There's a specific kind of loneliness, not the kind you feel when you're alone. That loneliness is simple, expected, manageable. The kind I feel is different. I feel loneliest when I'm surrounded by people, in rooms full of voices, at events crowded with faces. In moments when I'm least alone physically, I'm most alone emotionally. Today, I'm going to explain why. Why being surrounded doesn't prevent loneliness. Why sometimes it causes it. Why the more people around me, the more isolated I feel. Because this paradox, this painful paradox, is the reality of my life. Most people think loneliness comes from being alone, from isolation, from absence of people. It doesn't. Not for me. I'm never alone. Physically, I'm always surrounded by security, by advisors, by family, by staff, by people whose job is to be near me. But nearness is not connection. Presence is not intimacy. And being surrounded by people who see you as a function, not as a person, that's the loneliest feeling in the world, because you're visible, but unseen, present, but absent, speaking, but unheard. That's the paradox. I'm surrounded constantly, but I feel alone constantly. And the two don't cancel each other out. They amplify each other, because being surrounded by people who don't see you reminds you how alone you actually are, in ways that physical solitude never could. Family gatherings are the worst, not because my family is cruel, but because they see me as the crown prince first and person second. If they see the person at all, we sit together, we eat together, we fulfill the image of family, but the conversations are formal. How are the preparations going? What's the status of this project? Have you considered this decision? All functional, all focused on my role, never on me. No one asks how I actually am. Not really. Not in the way that invites honesty. They ask as formality and expect formality in return, so I give it. Everything is progressing well. I'm managing. Elle is under control. And the conversation moves on without ever touching anything real. I sit there, surrounded by family, laughing when appropriate, responding when addressed, present in every physical way, but completely alone, because no one is looking for the person. They're checking on the function, and confirming the function is operational. That confirmation doesn't require seeing me, just seeing that I'm fulfilling expectations. So I leave those gatherings feeling emptier than when I arrived, not because they were hostile, but because they were hollow, full of people, empty of connection. That's the first way I feel loneliest, when surrounded. Family gatherings that look like connection, but feel like performance. Public events are even worse. Hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, all looking at me, all watching, all present. And I've never felt more alone, because they're not seeing me. They're seeing the crown prince, the symbol, the position. I walk through crowds, I shake hands, I smile, I engage, but every interaction is transactional. They want a photo, they want acknowledgement, they want to say they met me, but they don't want to know me, they don't want to understand me, they don't want connection, they want confirmation. Confirmation that I exist, that they were close to power, that they were seen by someone important. And I give them that, I fulfill that function. But after hours of that, after hundreds of interactions, I feel nothing but exhaustion and loneliness, deep, aching loneliness, because I was surrounded by people all day, and not one of them saw me, not one asked how I was and meant it. Not one looked past the title. I was visible to everyone and invisible to everyone at the same time. That's the paradox, being the center of attention and feeling completely unseen, being surrounded by people and feeling utterly alone. Public events are supposed to be connecting. They're supposed to remind you you're part of something. But for me, they do the opposite. They remind me how separate I am, how isolated, how alone, even in crowds, The loneliest moments happen at home with my wife. We're alone together, just the two of us. No crowds, no cameras, no performance, theoretically. But I feel loneliest there because she's right beside me and I'm still alone. We exist in the same space. We share a life structurally. We have children together. We fulfill our roles together, but we're not together, not emotionally. We sit in silence, not the comfortable silence of people who understand each other, the empty silence of people who have nothing to say, because there's no connection to build conversation on, no shared intimacy, no emotional foundation, just structure, function, routine. She's there, physically present, but I'm alone because presence without connection is worse than absence. Absence, you can explain, you can understand. Someone's not there, so you feel alone. That makes sense. But when someone is there, right beside you, and you still feel alone, that's devastating because it reveals the truth that proximity doesn't create connection, that sharing space doesn't mean sharing life, that you can be married and still be completely, utterly alone. That's the loneliest feeling, not when I'm physically alone, but when I'm physically with my wife and emotionally isolated. That loneliness has no excuse, no explanation, no justification. It just is, and it's unbearable. The paradox exists because of one simple truth. People see my position, not me. They interact with the crown prince, not the person. And the crown prince doesn't need connection. He needs function. So people give me function. They fulfill their roles. They provide what's required. But they don't see me because seeing me is not required. Only seeing that I'm functioning is required. That's why I feel loneliest when surrounded. Because being surrounded by people who only see your function reminds you how invisible your humanity is. You're the most visible person in the room and the most unseen. The paradox also exists because I don't let people in, not fully. I have learned that vulnerability is dangerous, that showing weakness creates problems, that expressing need invites judgment. So I stay guarded, even when surrounded, especially when surrounded. I perform composure, I maintain distance, I protect myself. And that protection keeps me safe, but it also keeps me alone, because connection requires vulnerability, and I don't offer that, not to family, not to my wife, not to anyone. So I'm surrounded by people, but separated by walls I've built, walls that protect me and isolate me, both at once. That's why the paradox exists, not just because people don't see me, but because I don't let them. And that choice, necessary as it is, creates the loneliness I live with. This loneliness won't end. Not because I don't want it to, but because the conditions that create it are permanent. I will always be the crown prince. People will always see that first. My role will always matter more than my humanity. That's not going to change. My marriage will always be arranged. The distance will always exist. Connection won't develop over time because the foundation wasn't connection. It was arrangement, and arranged foundations don't produce intimacy. They produce function, and function is all we'll ever have. I will also always be guarded. I've learned too much to unlearn it. I've been hurt too much to be vulnerable again. I've sacrificed too much to risk more loss. So the walls will stay. The distance will remain. The protection will continue. And with it, the loneliness, because loneliness is not just absence of people, it's absence of being known. And I'm not known, not by anyone, not fully, not in the way that makes you feel less alone. I'm seen as a position. I'm valued as a function. I'm needed as a role, but I'm not known as a person. And that gap between being needed and being known, that's where the loneliness lives permanently. Feeling lonely when surrounded feels like drowning in shallow water. Help is everywhere. People are everywhere, but no one sees you're drowning because you're not visibly struggling. You're functioning, smiling, engaging, so they assume you're fine. And you can't tell them you're not, because telling them would create problems, would make them uncomfortable, would reveal weakness. So you stay silent and you drown quietly, surrounded by people who could help, but don't know you need it. It also feels like screaming into silence. You're speaking, you're present, you're expressing. But no one hears the actual words. They hear the function, the response, the role, but not the person. So you scream louder inside while appearing calm outside. And that gap between internal desperation and external composure, that's exhausting. More exhausting than actual solitude. Because solitude is honest. This is performance. Performance of being fine while feeling utterly alone. Why do I feel loneliest when surrounded by people? Because being surrounded doesn't prevent loneliness. Sometimes it causes it. When people see your function, not your humanity. When proximity exists, but connection doesn't. When you're visible, but unseen. When you're needed, but not known. That's when loneliness hits hardest, not in empty rooms, but in full ones, not in silence, but in noise, not in absence, but in presence that doesn't actually see you. I'm surrounded constantly by family who see the crown prince, by crowds who see the symbol, by a wife who sees the arrangement, but no one sees me. So I'm always alone, even when I'm never alone. That's the paradox, the painful, permanent paradox of being the most visible person and the most invisible, of being constantly surrounded and constantly isolated. That's my loneliness, not caused by absence, but by a presence that doesn't connect. And that loneliness, structural, permanent loneliness, is what I live with every single day, surrounded by everyone, known by no one. If you've ever felt alone in a crowded room, you understand. The loneliest moments aren't when you're by yourself. They're when you're surrounded by people and still completely unseen